I would say that the idea behind my choice of subject, partly what Phil has told you, but also I was thinking that the situation in New York prior to the foundation of the Metropolitan Museum in 1870 is actually rather parallel to what is happening here in the Gulf as new collections are being formed and museums being established. So I thought the subject had some sort of special relevance for today and for this place. Our talks this evening will offer you two glimpses of the Metropolitan Museum's holdings of Islamic art. My talk will focus on the building of the collection between the museum's foundation in 1870 and approximately 1930. The museum's current holdings of more than 12,000 objects from the Islamic Near East, Central Asia, and India reflect the taste, enthusiasm, and generosity of donors, as well as the expertise of its curators. As you have heard, Dr. Haider's comments to follow will focus on the current shape of the collection, as well as our plans for the museum's new installation of Islamic art, which will be opening in the fall of 2011. Taken together, these two different aspects of the collection's life will, I hope, encourage you to visit New York once our reinstallation has been completed. Although from 1903 onward, an unexpected and generous bequest from Joseph S. Rogers permitted the museum staff to purchase objects of their own choosing, in the period between the museum's first foundation in 1870 and about, as I said, 1930, its holdings from the Near East were dominated by gifts and bequests. I have chosen the date of 1930 for the terminal point of my talk because it was only in 1928 that a curator was appointed to the museum staff who had academic training in history and culture of the Near East. So from 1930 onward, the curatorial expertise has really been the dominant force which has shaped the collection and its presentation. Actually, though, from 1930 onward, it would be several more decades before an actual department of Islamic art would be founded, and where that department would be given a dedicated space for the collection's display. And I show you this is the area where it will be on display on the second floor, and you see the wing of the museum under construction in 1915. This is something called Wing K. Before 1970, the various ways in which the museum's Islamic holdings were displayed reflects a larger evolution of the institution. And so I will begin my remarks with a brief history of the museum's foundation and the sort of major phases of the building itself. Today, the Metropolitan Museum is a stately presence on New York's Fifth Avenue. The building's neoclassical facade, which stretches from 80th to 84th Streets over more than 330 meters, is one of the iconic images associated with the city of New York. For a visitor, the majestic regularity of the entryway, with its grand staircase and its well-proportioned porch, give the impression of permanence and order. The message of stability and regularity conveyed by the facade is, however, not the whole story. Even a cursory glance at the museum's western facade from the adjacent section of Central Park hints at the intricacy of this building's history. The presence of a crane, which is actually behind a tree. There's almost always a crane. Of course, you have a lot of those here, so you know all about that. The presence of a crane and a temporary wooden fence is an indication that this manifestly composite building has been under almost continuous construction and reconstruction since its initial foundation in 1874. The diversity of the building is particularly striking in the northern and southern facades, where the carefully articulated neoclassical stone facade on Fifth Avenue gives way to a glittering wall of glass that conceals from us the organization and contents of the interior. This is the northern facade. Here's the southern facade. You can see in both cases you have a little bit of neoclassical architecture, and then there's a great expanse of glass, which is really impenetrable. First, however, let us turn back to the clock to the period just before the building came to exist. The image you see is a plan for Central Park published in 1870. This plan was published by the group who were responsible for the planning of the park, namely the Central Park Commission, and they still exist. It was charged, the commission, with the development and care of a park first established in 1853. There was substantial opposition within the commission and within the community of New York to any buildings within the park. But they decided that it was appropriate to house buildings and situate buildings around the perimeter. Although the present location of the museum on the eastern edge of Central Park, and you maybe not, see this very easily, but it's this little spot right here is where the museum is. I mean, that's where they were expecting to build it, 1870. It's not quite the way the museum came to look, but that's the spot. In 1870, this area around Central Park was only sparsely inhabited, and many thought it was much too far from the city's center, then located at 14th Street, and so that very few visitors would ever venture to this very distant location. Many people thought that the space now used by the New York Public Library reference collection between 40th and 42nd Street was a much better location for the museum because of its proximity to the city's center. At the time of its legal incorporation, April 1870, the museum was a concept, an inspiration. It had no collection. It had no building. It had no budget. And it had no paid employees. What it did have was a small group of enthusiastic supporters, almost entirely male, who were convinced that a city of the size and importance of New York deserved a municipal museum. They were not so clear about what kind of collection it needed, but they were convinced that the museum could play an important role in the education of the city's populace and symbolize its cultural values. They were certain that New York's status and importance required a museum, and they worked to make it happen. This small group of men, who evolved into the Board of Trustees, dedicated themselves to the museum's establishment. They did it all. They rented buildings, they mounted exhibitions, unpacking, arranging, and repacking borrowed artifacts. At the same time, they struggled to build its collection through donations and lobbied to persuade municipal authorities to select a place upon which to build a permanent house for this new collection. After Central Park had been selected, the attention then turned to what kind of building they really should build. So here is what eventually came to pass, but let's go forward to the first stage of things. In the beginning, from its very creation, the museum was a hybrid creation. The land on which it sits belongs to the city of New York, as does the building. But the collection belongs to the trustees. The first stage in the museum's history was intimately linked with the design of Central Park, in part because the same architects, Calvert Vaux and Jacob Mould, were involved in the two projects. Here, the red drawing represents their overall plan, but the dark central rectangle represents the section actually constructed. As you can see, the earliest part of the museum was a rectangular hall with an east-west axis. This part of the building, erected between 1874 and 1880, had eventually three sections, a central pillared hall and two rows of narrow rectangular spaces. It's currently used to house the museum's collection of medieval and Byzantine art. This modest building, intended to be part of a much more elaborate structure, as you can see, the overall plan of the earliest building was really very ambitious. So we have two aspects of this first building phase. a modest beginning and a very ambitious plan. And the two came into collision in the area of the budget. And as would happen again, the budget triumphed and the ambitious vision was scaled back to fit the available funds. Within a few years, however, the 1880 section, which is right here in the middle, absolute center of the building, had been surrounded by a larger space, and that's this sort of, this area here. And that is what it looked like in 1895. The modest hall had been surrounded by a regular, nearly square building of red brick, ornamented with contrasting colors of stone. The southern wall of the 1894 phase is still exposed today for its full length, and it gives us a good idea of the overall appearance of the building originally constructed. We see here red brick walls and white marble trim. This colorful architectural style is often called High Victorian Gothic. In the midst of this careful facade, we see this colorful facade, we see a kind of neoclassical portico, which is a hint of things to come. In the subsequent phases of the building, as we saw, the facade will become clearly neoclassical. There's one more place, and here's the way the facade originally looked before the addition was put on the building. We also can see a glimpse of this early building, 1884 building, from the north, where we see it through a 1975 edition for the Lehman collection. And again, that was the way it would have looked before the other parts of the building were added. So let us go back to 1895. This 1895 photograph shows the museum as it was when it received the first major donation of objects from the Islamic Near East, which was in 1891. It consisted of nearly 500 objects that had been collected by Edward Chandler Moore. Here he is. You can see Edward Chandler Moore, 1827, 1891. This collection, so the collecting of materials was encouraged by the museum's 1870 charter. That documented the ambitious goal of collecting objects from all periods and regions of the world and displaying those materials for the pleasure and edification of the public. So the Metropolitan Museum from the very beginning intended to be a comprehensive, universal museum, which is was a very bold idea, especially since they actually had nothing when they started. So they had a grand goal. These convictions that it should collect the art of every place and every time merged with an attitude known as the aesthetic movement, which viewed the world's artistic heritage as a vast storehouse to be used without reference to the time and place of an original creation. This decontextualized and dehistoricized view of art emboldened collectors to combine elements from different periods, regions, and cultures into a new whole. As we will see, these features are also exemplified in the life and work of Edward Chandler Moore. Let us first look at some of the wonderful objects that he donated to the museum in his bequest of 1891. They include finely decorated glass. He had real fondness for glass. This is the way it looks. You look down on it. It's hard with things which are gold. It's hard to see them in reflected light. This is another absolutely wonderful glass decorated platter. Also ceramics. He had beautiful ceramics. And especially metalwork. He particularly favored metalwork objects with inlay decoration, and his taste was not limited to one period or area. He does seem, however, to have had a particular fondness for the arts of Syria and Egypt from the mid-13th to mid-15th centuries in the Mamluk period. Edward Chandler Moore was born into a family of silversmiths who were among the most talented and popular in New York in the 19th century. He combined consummate craftsmanship with an eye for design, which allowed him to create objects of shimmering beauty, which draw upon multiple artistic traditions. Moore's most important designs were created in the 1870s and 1880s, when they repeatedly won prizes at international fairs and expositions. This is the era of international expositions in Paris, in London, in Chicago, and so forth. And there were great contests between people for prizes. And Moore's silver took first prize several times. And it was a great astonishment to people that an American silversmith would actually triumph over European silversmiths. So he became very famous. Some of Moore's designs reflect his knowledge in and interest of the art of the Islamic Near East. Several features of this silver ewer, which was made in 1874, recall the art of the Near East. They include the tall, slender shape and the floral ornament embossed on its lower sections. These patterns are reminiscent of designs in two pieces from 16th century Ottoman period, which are actually in Moore's collection and now in the Metropolitan Museum. So, for example, the little flowers here, the leaves. So it's not exactly like anything Ottoman, but it sort of draws on it, recreates it, sort of rearranges it, which is very much, I think, in the spirit of the aesthetic movement. And here is another one of Moore's designs, where we see a kind of mixture. I think he used textiles, I think, the kind of palmettes, which really are in the background, and especially he was drawing on this object, which he owned, for the silver inlay niello banding. I mean, it's a combination which doesn't exist on the Near Eastern object, but of course that's, again, the sort of point of view of the aesthetic period, that you combine things from different periods and different styles. So we have, and he often used textiles as reference points for his silver creations. Finally, the fact that Moore's portrait, painted in 1889, and actually this portrait commemorates another prize. It's when the French government gave him the Légion d'honneur, and the occasion he marked by having his portrait painted. And as you can see, his portrait was painted with him sitting in front of an object, which he subsequently donated to the Metropolitan Museum, and it will be one of the important objects in the new display, which will open in the fall of 2011. You can see, is behind him here, and that's the actual door. So Moore is very associated in a lot of people's minds with Japanese-style objects, but he obviously had a great fondness for the art of Near East, not only because he collected 500 objects, but he used them in his own creative work. And Moore's collecting of Islamic art actually grew out of his business arrangement, because in 1867, he sold his silversmith practice to Tiffany. That is Louis Comfort Tiffany, and who was, again, second-generation silver merchant, and he took the money from his sale of his business to Tiffany and created the collection, which he then donated after his death in 1891. I would say it's difficult to overestimate the importance of Chandler Moore and his bequest for the collection if the museum had never gotten another object beyond the 500 that he gave. It would really be a major collection, but of course it went on to get other gifts, and that's what I'm going to turn to now. My second example of a collector and donor, Alexander Smith Cochran, you see his dates, 1874-1929, occupies a similar niche in a different area, that of illustrated and illuminated manuscripts. The 15 manuscripts of the Cochran donation of 1913 are still today of central importance for the Metropolitan Museum collection. Because I have yet to locate a portrait of Alexander Cochrane, I'm just substituting his name. So I'm sorry I can't show you what he looked like. This much I do know. Alexander Cochrane was born in Yonkers, and he inherited what the New York Times called a vast fortune in 1908. And this was a fortune from his maternal grandfather. It was actually $40 million in 1908. It was a lot of money. And his maternal grandfather had a carpet mill, the Smith Carpet Mill in Yonkers, which in 1929 was the world's largest carpet mill. So he was a rich man who became a very successful businessman. He was a lifelong bachelor, and as far as I can tell, his great passion was sailing. He must be among, actually this is very unusual, he must be among the very, very few private individuals to have commissioned and donated a warship to the British Navy. He did that in World War I. I think they're probably rather startled that somebody show up with a warship, but anyway, they took it. Evidence about what led Alexander Cochrane to collect manuscripts in Arabic, Turkish, and Persian, languages which I'm certain he did not know, is only indirect, but I think consistent. I believe that the inspiration for the collection, let me just show you, you can have a look at one of his donations here while I talk about him. The inspiration came from one of his neighbors in Yonkers, but in the name of Abraham Valentine Williams Jackson. He was called more familiarly Williams Jackson, but he had 4 names. So Abraham Valentine Williams Jackson was a neighbor of Cochrane's in Yonkers, and they met at a ball on a New Year's Eve and came to discuss the Near East. Now, Williams Jackson was the first professor of Indo-Persian at Columbia University. He taught Sanskrit, he taught Avestan, he taught Prakrit, he was an extraordinary linguist. And he also knew, of course, modern Persian, and he loved Persian literature. And now Williams Jackson was also he was an extraordinary person, really amazing person. He was extremely hardworking. And he traveled in the Near East every chance he could. And he took Alexander Cochrane with him on one of his trips to Iran, where they traveled around by horse cart. I'm sure for Alexander Cochrane it was a bit of a come down, but still. They did travel in Iran, and they traveled for a couple of months. And I think that visit to Iran is what probably catalyzed Alexander Cochrane's desire to purchase manuscripts in the Near Eastern languages. And so that is what he did. Now, it is actually possible, and I don't know this because there are no papers that I've found, that Alexander Cochrane acquired his manuscript collection with a specific goal of donating it to the Metropolitan Museum. Since he couldn't read it or didn't really have much interest in it, so that's quite possible, I think. In any event, he did donate it. The Metropolitan Museum archives contains a brief note sent by Cochrane to the museum's head of the Department of Decorative Arts, William R. Valentiner. And it's just really a little, like the kind of note people write for thank yous or something like that. You know, it's a little formal note in handwriting saying, I have some manuscripts. Would you come round and have a look and see if you would like them? So Valentiner went to Cochrane's New York house and discovered this manuscript collection, which Cochrane was prepared to donate. They didn't really know much about him. They didn't have any idea he was doing this. But once they saw what he was prepared to donate, they accepted it. The astonished trustees not only accepted the gift, but made Cochrane, gave him a seat on the Metropolitan Museum Board of Trustees. The Cochrane donation of manuscripts and album pages has the distinction also, and this is Williams Jackson, of being the only part of the Islamic collection to arrive already published in the catalog. The absolutely extraordinary industry of Professor Abraham Valentine Williams Jackson resulted in the fact that the publication of the collection and its donation have the same date of 1913. Let me now share with you a few examples taken from Alexander Cochrane's donation. Here we see 2 pages from a copy of Nizami's epic, the Hafbekar, produced for the Timurid prince and bibliophile by Sangur ibn Shahrukh about 1430 and probably in Herat. These paintings show the delicate execution and harmonious colors found in the best manuscripts of the period. The Cochrane collection is particularly rich in copies of Nizami's poems, and here we have 2 pages from another copy about 100 years later, about 1530, that was produced for a Safavid patron, and it's perhaps he who is depicted in these images. It was as the sort of princely figure in the throne and then in the embrace of the lovely lady. The 16th century manuscript is notable for its intricate and precisely executed patterns found on textiles and architectural settings. So the paintings have a kind of jewel-like quality. My final example I want to share with you is for paintings from a Mughal copy of Khusro Dehlavi's Hamza from the early 17th century. These pictures are really extraordinary. They're just amazing. Have a rich palette of colors, subtly modeled shapes, and figures portrayed with deep psychological insight. They're really, you can't look at these a few minutes. You have to really deeply study them to see all their features. They're really quite remarkable. So I think Dr. Haidar is actually going to share some of her thoughts about this manuscript too when she tells you about the reinstallation of the collection. As you can see from these few examples, Alexander Smith Cochrane may have been an unlikely candidate to have given the Metropolitan Museum such an extraordinary collection of manuscripts, but by so doing, he provided the museum with treasures that we can all appreciate. During the first decades of the 20th century, the museum's holdings of Islamic materials were enriched by donations by a number of important individuals: J. Pierpont Morgan, Bernard Altman, a name from the world of commerce, and 2 generations of the Havemeyer family. Although the Havemeyer family's generosity in giving the Metropolitan Museum paintings by the leading French painters of the 19th century, Degas, Renoir, Cézanne, Manet, is particularly well known. The family also donated ceramic vessels, manuscript pages, metalwork, and other kinds of objects of the Islamic period. The bequest of the Havemeyer collection came between 1929 and 1930 and included more than 1,900 items. It's really an enormous collection. Only a part of it is Near Eastern. Many of it is paintings. Many of these things, however, that were donated in 1929, 1930, I think had actually been purchased in the late 19th century by the founder of the collection and the family patriarch, Henry Osborne Havemeyer, and his wife, Louisine Elder Havemeyer. The donation was actually carried out by their son, Horace Havemeyer, who continued to enrich the collection down to his death in the 1950s. He also became a museum trustee. The Havemeyer and Elder fortune was founded on a monopoly of sugar production in the United States, which they had until Teddy Roosevelt abolished or had the laws passed about monopolies in the early 20th century. So in the late 19th century, the Havemeyers, again, were enormously rich, and they used much of their wealth to purchase works of art. Each of these gifts has added something new to the collection. And as my final example, I've decided to focus on James Franklin Ballard, 1851-1931. And I have actually a picture of him dated to 1924. Mr. Ballard was born into a prosperous family with substantial holdings of timber. But he crafted his own personal fortune by selling to the public various elixirs which promised enhanced health. Although I have no personal experience with any of these, they did have wonderful names. The thing which really made his fortune was something called Ballard's Snow Liniment. He also sold Smith's Panacea and Burt's Bile Beans. So he had a repertoire of patent medicines, and he made a really great deal of money selling them. Now, whatever these potions may have done for the people who consumed them, they provided James Franklin Ballard with the resources to build a large and varied collection of rugs. Mr. Ballard has the distinction of being a major donor of the Metropolitan Museum, who was not a New Yorker. He was born in Ashtabula, Ohio, which is on Lake Erie, but he spent most of his life in the city of St. Louis. And in fact, he also donated many carpets to the St. Louis Art Museum, where he was a trustee, and he was very active in civic affairs in St. Louis. He was a banker also in St. Louis. So, but he came to New York and sort of presented the museum with a collection of rugs in 1922. And he says that he picked out the ones to give to the Metropolitan Museum by looking at the rest of their holdings and decided which of his rugs would be most useful to the Met to complete their collection. And this exhibition of 1922 is photographed, and I'm going to show you some of the historic photographs of this 1922 exhibition as a background for my comments on his rugs. Now, Mr. Ballard was really very devoted to the idea of carpets and collecting them, and he had a passionate belief in their importance. And this is what he says. This is a general statement, not about a particular rug, but rugs in general. These symbols and designs carry us back to past ages. They are full of love, passion, sentiment, religion, mysticism, tribal tradition, and tragedy. What sacrifice could one not afford to possess these beautiful pieces? And one of the things he always told people was how many thousands of miles he traveled in making his collection. And the largest number, I thought, was 475,000 miles to collect these rugs. I'm happy to report that the rugs donated by James Ballard will play an important role in the planned reinstallations of the Islamic galleries. But in the interim, I want to share with you a few examples of the impressive carpets by comparing recent color photographs with the historic views of the 1922 exhibition. So this is sort of the entrance into the exhibition. This is a view of the interior. He was really extremely enthusiastic about Anatolian prayer carpets. So we have lots and lots of Anatolian prayer carpets. This is a very famous one, which comes from the Ottoman court, sort of mid-16th century, one of the real treasures of the collection. He also, but he loved rugs from everywhere. He collected rugs from every area that made significant rugs. This is a Caucasian rug. He has wonderful rugs from the Caucasus. And here we see more of the exhibition. Here we see some more Turkish rugs. And in the back, we see some rugs from northwestern Iran, where he also had a large collection of those rugs. Here's one of a type which is often called a Herat rug, although we're not always sure that actually it came from Herat. So the Ballard collection came to the museum in 1922, and it still forms really the backbone of the carpet collection, although individual rugs have been added to it, and there were individual rugs before, but it is really the sort of foundation of the carpet collection, and it has it has a wonderful garden carpet. This is a particularly lovely kind of carpet where you have a sort of landscape in a very schematized way with fish and plants. But he was also very Catholic in his taste for carpets. He liked also peasant rugs, and he liked rugs. Of course, the carpet collectors are often very fond of the carpets of Central Asian nomads, the Turkic nomads. And here's a selection of carpets that include several pieces from the Central Asian area. This, for example, I think is a door surround, probably that one. And on the floor, On the floor here, I think we see a rug, which is actually a door hanging from a Turkmen tent. So Ballard collected Turkish rugs, he took classical rugs, he collected more contemporary village rugs, and from all the major rug producing areas of the Near East. So the story of these collectors in these collections, I hope has given you a glimpse of the holdings of the Metropolitan Museum. There were certainly important donors in later periods, but the examples I have shown you, I think, are notable for the scale of the collections. These early donors really gave volumes of objects which very few people subsequently were able to attain. It might seem strange that Americans were so devoted to the art of a distant region that few of them had ever seen. But as we can see, I've told you, the last decades of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century was a time of expansive vision. There was a kind of enthusiasm, a kind of energy, a kind of optimism, which translated itself into formation of major collections and the donation of them to the public. Thank you.
I'd like to start by thanking Professor Philip Kennedy and NYU Abu Dhabi for the honor of this invitation to speak tonight and to make a contribution to the cultural life of Abu Dhabi and to be here at this very exciting branch of NYU. So thank you. And I'd like to thank Professor Soucek for giving us a sense of how the great collections at the Metropolitan Museum were formed in their early moments. And as we leave the past, I'd like to actually move us towards the future and give you a sense of some of the plans that we have for the new galleries which are opening next year in October 2011. So I thought I'd start by giving you a sense of the collections and what the collections are like today. As Professor Soucek mentioned, we have almost 12,000 works of art in the collection. And these come from almost 40 different countries today, or what are today countries and states of different types. However, we can't, nobody really does it by country. It's really by region and by broad cultural categories that one divides the work. And therefore, we have 5 major categories in terms of the regions and the cultures that are represented, starting with the Arab world. And you see here 2 examples of works of art from the Arab world. This great wooden object that you see here is actually an element from a door from Egypt from the Fatimid period. The museum in Cairo has another one from the same door, and these are the only 2 known. And this folio here is a folio from the famous Blue Quran, which is one of the most celebrated early Qurans, also from North Africa, attributed to the 9th century, and said to be an imitation of Royal Byzantine manuscripts with its gold and blue coloring. The second category of material that we have, or region that we represent, is the art of Turkey. And here we have the Tughra, or the imperial ensign of the great Ottoman Emperor Suleiman the Magnificent. This great calligraphic achievement that you see here. And we also have at the museum a great collection of Ottoman textiles, this one being, this great wavy example being one of the celebrated works in the collection. Moving on, we have many works of art from Iran, and I would say actually about 60% of the collection probably comes from all phases of Iranian artistic achievement. These 2 that I'm showing you on the screen actually come from the later period, from the Safavid period. And you have on the screen a carpet, which is one of 4 silk carpets from Kashan. This one being the most famous and will hopefully be in the entrance gallery just as you enter the display. And here we have several paintings by the celebrated Isfahani master Raza Abbasi. Central Asia is a region that has works of art produced from very ancient times, and many different departments in the museum have works of art from Central Asia. In our department, that is the Islamic department, we have examples of inlaid metalwork, and this is a very famous ewer with all sorts of interesting aspects to its decoration. And here we have an example of a high tin bronze vessel from Afghanistan, datable to about the 11th century. And the last category of material or region that we represent is our works of art from later South Asia. And when I say later South Asia, of course, I mean from the period of about 1500 onwards, the year 1500 onwards, when you had Muslim courts in South Asia, and the most famous of them probably being the court of the Mughals and the Mughal rulers. And here, in fact, you have a folio from the Kevorkian album, one of the treasures in the collection, showing the Emperor Shah Jahan astride a stallion. And we have a few examples of the jewel darts of the Mughal period represented here by this little mango flask made out of rock crystal and decorated with rubies and emeralds. So this very quick survey should give you a sense of what the character of the collection is. But as I said, it's 12,000 objects, so these few objects that I've shown you are just a little representation of the full strength of the collection. Now, in 1975, a very significant thing happened in the world, in our field of Islamic art and also in the world of museums, which is that a great and celebrated installation dedicated to Islamic art on a great scale was established at the Metropolitan Museum under the leadership of Professor Ettinghausen of Princeton University and a great talented curatorial team and a great commitment from the museum. And these are the galleries that the world came to know and love, shown here in this slide. And you can see from the vaulted ceiling just above that this is in fact in the wing that Professor Soucek showed you, the wing K that was coming up and was originally designed by McKim, Mead and White, one of the most famous firms, well, probably the most famous architectural firm in the world in its heyday, certainly. A firm that had a great impact on the architecture of the East Coast and whose neoclassical legacy is seen in the museum and seen in the styling of this wing. And this is the space which was then occupied by the 1975 galleries. And this is the space which my generation of curators has inherited. And we have to work with all this great legacy. We have to engage with McKim, Mead and White. We have to engage with the previous installation. We have to take all that was great about those previous moments and move forward with a vision that's greatly enriched with all of these different aspects of the past. And so, as I move forward, I hope that the ideas and the information that I'm able to share today, does something of that, because that's certainly been our aim. Now, it's hard to talk about a space that's thousands of kilometers away from here, and that's a 3D space through a 2D medium. And I'm going to do it today with the help of computer renderings, which our architectural firm has produced, and which will give you some sense of the interiors. But I'm also counting on your imagination, because you need to fill in texture and color and light where the computer can't do it. But I'm going to start by showing you the floor plan of the space. This is a space of about 18,000 square feet, which I think is about 1,800 meters. And as you can see, it goes around 15 galleries are arranged around a central court. And the central court down below is actually an area where there's a display of Roman statues. It's a Roman court down below. And our Islamic wing can actually overlook and get views of the Roman court, which I'll show you in a minute. This space is designed to go around, and there are several points of entry. And that's a very significant thing to think about, because when you're trying to tell a story, or trying to lay out objects to sort of express themselves, let's say through time and space, how you enter that space and how the public or the visitor experiences that space is a very important aspect to how you actually tell the story. If it's all just linear, it's in some ways easier. But in our case, we didn't do it the linear way. We're offering the public many choices. You can either enter this way, you can enter this way, or you can enter this way. And we have to make sure that you're able to understand the material and engage with the material no matter how you approach it. Ideally, you should enter the introductory gallery and go around in this direction and branch off into the outer galleries there, which will give you a sense of the chronology. It is in fact the didactic route, if you like. It will give you, following the sweep of Islamic civilization through its entire historical and geographic spread across the world, is what you would experience if you followed this route. However, if you entered from here, you would actually enter from a space which is now, which belongs to the to the European department, and a gallery which houses their Orientalist paintings. And so through that introduction, you would enter a gallery devoted to the arts of Mamluk, of the Mamluk period, Cairo, Egypt, and Syria. And if you were to enter this way, you would actually find yourself in an area that's slightly outside the footprint of the Islamic galleries, if you like, an area dedicated to the arts of later South Asia. Because as you know, India was the one area where both Islamic and non-Islamic civilization flourished at exactly the same time, interacting with each other, exchanging influences and developing together. And really to separate those two would be the wrong thing to do. So that's the kind of entranceway that we've imagined you could experience in different ways. Now, signage and titling is a very important part of one's work, because how you describe something is an extremely it becomes a definition of everything. And so just the words Islamic art for us, for this generation and this moment, didn't do the trick, because we really wanted to emphasize a sense of place and a sense of variety and a sense of regional expression, as much as a sense of unity brought about by the concept and the influence of the Islamic tradition. So what we decided to do was to balance the titling across the portal, the front portal, in such a way to give the visitor that experience of the regions that they're going to see, which they'll see above the door, and the reason that those regions are together, which is that these are part of the Islamic world. And so that those two bits of information should be able to help the visitor understand what they're going to see. And I should just mention that here the second entrance will just be marked later South Asia, because if you recall, that's the entrance that's going into the sort of offshoot of South Asia. And here's a bit more on the signage. This is not exactly the map that we will use, but it's just to help you understand how that information will be relayed to the visitor. Now trying to move forward into the spaces. Here is a computer-generated vision of what our introduction gallery might look like. And even though a computer can't introduce the sense of the detail and the warmth of a space, you will be able to hopefully get the sense of a very bright white room dressed in white marble. And that choice was very deliberate, because we wanted to choose a material that you find unifying lots of different types of architecture of different periods through the Islamic world. And you will also see that a certain floor pattern has been chosen to inlay into the floor, and I'll be telling you a little bit more about that. The idea of this room, though, is to basically showcase some of the highlights of the collection, and so therefore just seduce the visitor basically into wanting to know more, because in the end, how you start is such an important thing. And I was very happy. We went to Qatar yesterday to see the Islamic Museum there, and Professor Suchek and I saw that the Islamic Museum, their introduction also has this idea of having a masterpiece gallery right in the beginning, and it's most effective. It's absolutely exciting and makes you want to see more when you see an array of absolutely fabulous things right in the beginning. So in this space, we will be able to show manuscripts and paintings in this case. We will have freestanding cases with individual masterpieces, and we will have, there's that carpet that I showed you earlier. We will have objects like that on the wall. Here's a great calligraphic panel from Bengal. Looking the other way, that's where we came in from. Looking in the opposite direction, you will see that there are two jalis, or pierced stone windows in the wall, and those are actually 16th century windows or jalis from Mughal India, and they being the largest architectural elements, historic architectural elements in the space, have actually inspired us to go with a floor design that relates to those jalis. So I'm going to give you a bit more information on that. These are in fact those great 16th century jalis, and you can see how fantastic they are. They're made of red Mathura sandstone, and they have a variety of geometric patterns interlocking in different ways. And when you look at the floor design, you'll see that this pattern that you see around the floor and the central medallion are really related to the kinds of patterns that you see in Mughal buildings of the same period where you would see the jalis. And most especially, you see this pattern in the Taj Mahal. We went to the very top for inspiration, as you can see, and this great running band of a very classically Islamic pattern, a pattern that you see not only in India in this case, but you see it in in the Mamluk world and other parts. You see it in Morocco. You see it in many different parts of the Islamic world. It was really a very unifying pattern, which also related very well to those sandstone jalis. We paid a lot of attention to the technique of actually putting this decoration into the floor, because a great idea can be completely undone by poor execution, and we had very high standards to live up to, namely the great inlay work that you see in Agra in the Mughal buildings there. And so we looked hard at the way they do inlays in stone floors in Agra, and you can see how extraordinary that is. That's just a single piece of marble going all the way around, and the seams are almost invisible. And when they do occur, they're very sensitively put in places so that your eye doesn't get, the pattern doesn't break up into a way or isn't interrupted in a way that is unpleasant for your eye. So all of these points of detail were studied before we went in for that kind of design. And we're hoping and praying that nothing goes wrong between the idea and the execution, because it's actually much harder than one imagines to get it all right. The idea of a screen and a filtered light as a metaphor for Islamic space, for concepts in Islamic art, and for actual realization in Islamic buildings is something that's carried on through other parts of the space as well. As you enter the main galleries and the whole area going around that central court I showed you, those windows looking down onto the Roman court below will actually also be screened. And in this case, rather than having Indian stone screens, we are having Egyptian mashrabiyah type screens being made for us by a very talented group from Cairo. And this is also a way for us to introduce contemporary crafts. And this is actually what the construction site looks like right now. And we have a mock-up. This is a sort of an approximation of what the screens might be going around the Roman court. One of the new features in the gallery is the creation of a Moroccan court made by craftsmen from Fez. And in some ways, this court has a practical function. It stops one gallery from running into another when we don't want them to. And also, but more importantly, it's really a space for us to represent the great contemporary living traditions of the Islamic world, and to create a space that's just filled with light and color and water. I mean, water is such an important metaphor for Islamic architecture, and since we can't show Islamic architecture very easily, obviously, in the galleries, we can evoke it and evoke a sense of Islamic space, if you like, through spaces such as this. And this is actually quite a small, intimate space, but it will have this feature of having an absolutely open window to look down at the Roman court below. And the reason for this is not just, apart from the pleasant experience of being able to stand in one civilization, if you like, and overlook another, it's also to remind us that our civilizations are built upon each other, and that certainly the early Islamic period and other periods are all sort of, in some sense, following on from what was there in the classical period before. And in Morocco, you often have this experience of being in an Islamic space right next to a Roman space. So it made a lot of sense in terms of creating that kind of context. And I know that all the children who love to visit the museum are going to love to throw pennies in that fountain. It's very important to be able to think of ways of engaging all sorts of audiences. One of the new features in the galleries is going to be a space, a gallery dedicated to the arts of the Islamic West. And this is going to be achieved by collaborating with a group called the Hispanic Society of America. This is an institution that is of great eminence, but very unfortunately for them, poorly located in a part of New York which nobody ever visits. And they are very keen to join forces with us and lend to the Metropolitan Museum their best Islamic pieces, because they really would like the public to be able to appreciate what they have and enjoy what they have. And from the point of view of the Metropolitan, we can join forces to create an expression of the Islamic West, which we felt is, in today's context, such an important point to make. And so from their collection, we have a gilded capital from one of the great Umayyad capitals, cities of Spain. We also have examples of Spanish lusterware. One of the most famous ivory pyxes of the early Umayyad period is in the collection of the Hispanic Society, and that's this magnificent pyxis that you see here. And they also have a great collection of Nasrid period textiles, and that's what we will be able to show in the gallery, along with our own, with the Metropolitan's own collection. So it'll be a very strong and very new expression, a new feature of the galleries. I talked about the gallery that is devoted to the arts of Egypt and Syria that connects with the Orientalism gallery. And in this space, you'll see that we have we have this feature of modern lamps. It's a space where we'll be showing the collection of gilded lamps of the 13th, 14th century. But above your head, you'll actually be able to see a kind of very modern installation. Just to liven up the space, really, we had to find mosque lamp blowers because this is blown glass. And we didn't have to go very far because right in Brooklyn, New York, which is right next door to Manhattan, and we found actually glass artists, this gentleman and this lady, who were absolutely delighted to actually have an opportunity to learn how to blow and work with Islamic glass. And so they've produced these mock-ups of lamps in the traditional style with bubbles and a little bit of color, and they're actually going to be creating these lamps for us. And it's just, you know, in the course of this project, it's so very nice to be able to bring different artists together from different traditions and have them do creative projects around the installation. I had pointed out that this gallery is right here, showing this kind of material, and adjoining it is the gallery devoted to the Orientalist paintings. This isn't the Islamic department, as this is the European department, but isn't it great to be able to show paintings like this by Jerome, showing the interior of a mosque, right next to the gallery that actually shows the Islamic art of the period that's being depicted. Moving on through the spaces, here's another computer rendering. You won't believe how good these computers are. Each one of those people is artificially generated and does not exist in reality at all. But for the purposes of our display, they are populating our gallery. And here you see that we have the Ottoman world. And the Ottoman world, of course, being the magnificent empire that it was, we wanted to give it a whole wing. And so we have a central Ottoman gallery that you see here. And to the left and right of it, we have additional spaces, one being a whole room from Ottoman Syria. And this is, in fact, the earliest dated room of its kind. It's dated 1707 and is a nobleman's room from Damascus. And on the other side, we will be showing many of the carpets that Professor Suchek showed that come from Anatolia. Now, apart from the spaces, I think what is very important to communicate is what are the ideas that we will be exploring through the collection. One basic fact that I told you is that we hope to lay it out by chronology and by region, emphasizing a sense of place and giving you a clear sense of time when you experience these objects. But the objects also lend themselves to certain themes being explored. And when these themes naturally arise from clusters of material, we are able to go into these subjects and to really study these ideas. And one of them, as we have in the entrance gallery, is the idea of a masterpiece. What defines a masterpiece? And why is it so important for us to know what a masterpiece is? And this is a very deep question, actually, because our human perception of so much is pinned on iconic images, on iconic works of art. In the Western world, they're so well known. I mean, everyone knows what the Mona Lisa is, and everyone knows famous works of Western architecture. In the Islamic world, there's still a mystery in some sense about what's really considered to be a masterpiece. Not for the scholar, certainly, we know, but for the public, really, we want to define that and show you what high points are. So, for example, in the entrance gallery, we will, through our painting collection, be able to show you the works of painting that came about in 15th century Iran, which is considered a classical moment, a great moment of achievement in the arts of the book. And these little details such as this, where you see a group of woodcutters as part of a folio, is a kind of huge innovation in the arts, where the life of a humble woodcutter, the way he cuts wood, the way he puts it on his donkey, the way he's working, these little vignettes of daily life have been elevated in the hands of the great master Behzad and his followers, by whom this painting is probably the work of one of his followers, to being an expression, an artistic expression of great sensitivity and importance. And this is one of the things that we'll try to do in the entrance gallery. Masterpieces are not just fine objects created for the court, but even simple tribal rugs such as this one, where you see a very exciting design of animals confronting each other, but animals within animals are to be celebrated. This rug actually is from the 14th century, and it's one of the earliest rugs of its kind, a kind of rug that was very popularly traded or sold in Europe, and you see a number of European paintings with carpets such as this. But do look at the design, because you see the two outer animals, and then within them you see a second set of animals, and that idea of confronting animals as a pattern is a very important and an ancient one. The joy of just looking at fantastic ink and line on a paper, on a piece of paper, and seeing the achievements of these artists of the Ottoman world that were trained in calligraphy as well as drawing is seen in a dragon drawing such as this. And you can see how the line going across the dragon's back becomes thicker and thinner at as it moves across the back of the dragon, and similarly outlines those leaves, those famous saz leaves, which are characteristic of Ottoman art. These points of connoisseurship almost are things that we would like to be able to point out. This is what makes this drawing, gives it its power and its sort of dynamism. And so that's the idea of masterpieces. Here's another masterpiece, a tiny ivory plaque from 10th or 11th century Cordoba in Spain, and incredibly deep carving, incredibly subtle interweaving of elements. I struggled to make sure you got the best possible slides. I hope you can see them on the screens up there, to see how leaves come in front of vines, and there's this incredible sense of depth and movement. And also you will see that there's a repetition of pattern, probably derived from the close relationship this plaque has to textiles that were produced of the same period. So these are the kinds of connections we can make through talking about masterpieces. Another important thing to discuss is cultural exchange, because no artist works in a vacuum. Artists are so influenced by other movements, by other achievements, and this happens historically through time. And so exchanges between China, Europe, and India, for example, in the Islamic world, are key to understanding many important aspects of the art. So for example, you have here a blue and white dish made in Ottoman Turkey, which almost certainly derives inspiration from Chinese wares of the same type. Here you have an Ottoman textile with a famous motif known as the chintamani, but the word chintamani really comes from Sanskrit, meaning the wishing stones associated with Buddhist iconography. And here you have a Portuguese figure painted in Iran in the 17th century. China and the Islamic world, you can see here you have a textile from China and here you have a tile made in Iran, both showing this fantastic motif of a phoenix with its streaming tail feathers. India and Europe, the luxury trade. I mean, yes, this is an Islamic box made in Mughal India, but it was made for European taste, and that's why you have European figures in this jungle hunting in the manner of Indian kings. And Professor Soucek showed in the work of one of the donors that she talked about the influences of Persian ceramics and Ottoman ceramics in his work. And similarly, we see that in so many examples. Here you have a Persian bottle, and here you have a much later bottle by a British designer, and you can see how the shape of the bottles, how this has been certainly influenced by that. And those sorts of connections arise naturally from the material. It's not a forced story by any means. It's something that we feel we can draw out because the material wants to illustrate it. I'm going to go very fast now because we don't have much time. The art of calligraphy is a very important binding tradition of the Islamic world. Science at the Islamic courts is another idea that we will be able to explore through the collections. And we will also be able to go into the issue of special techniques, such as the development of luster ceramics in the Islamic period. Inlaid metalwork. And of course, very importantly, the whole question of art and the religion of Islam, because if we are the Islamic department and many of these works of art are associated with the religion of Islam, where and how do these works actually express that? And in this case, we can show through this great mehrab, this is a prayer niche from a madrasa from Iran of the mid-14th century. This is a Quran stand with superb wooden carving, and here we have two pages from a very well-known Quran manuscript known as the Nurse's Quran. So these are objects that can be most directly related to the religious arts. Very quickly, the process, because people often ask us, what have you been doing since 2003, and which is when the galleries closed down, and 2011 there's such a big gap, and they don't know often how much has been achieved in this period. We had to survey the whole collection, that's 12,000 objects, look at each one, its condition, rate it, and here we are examining a textile, a Moroccan textile in the textile center. We then worked a great deal with models, because there are many different ways to approach designing a space, but to make your arguments work in a space, in the end you really have to visualize it in 3D. And so everything you're looking at right now on the screen is in fact a cardboard or paper model. And if I take you through the detail, you'll see that here we cut out every single object that was going to be in that display case to scale and put it in there, just to work out the relationships between the different objects, to make sure that they speak to each other, if you like, and that they all sit sympathetically in the case. We also were able to compose vistas, the idea of looking at a carpet through a screen, the way you would have in an original setting, and then to be able to go behind it and see it in its full glory. All of this had to be worked out and calculated in 3D. And so that's why we invested a lot of time working with this kind of, these kinds of methods. A great deal of work was done on the conservation of the objects. That room that I pointed out to you, the 1707 Damascus room, has been heavily conserved in the period, because insect infestation dating back maybe 200 years was finally corrected or stabilized. We also have a great Spanish ceiling of the 16th century that also needed a lot of work. So these conservation projects have been going on. And there have been quite amusing moments. For example, we had to move the fountain that goes in that Damascus room from one area to the other. And with all the high-tech gadgets of today, it still was determined that the best way to do it was to put cornstarch on the floor and to drag it across by the rope. And that would be the least disturbing, most stable way to actually move the fountain. That's what we did. But all of these things had to be planned and done in the raw space. One of the things that I particularly worked on was the display case for manuscripts. This is something that is very, very important, and something that a sensitive eye would, I think, really appreciate, because the old galleries, the 1975 installation, was greatly celebrated for being able to allow the public to sit down comfortably at a chair and look at works of art that were originally books or manuscripts, very finely painted, in a kind of relaxed way, and be able to take in all that incredible detail without getting tired standing on your feet, and also having a sense of the context of a book rather than a painting stuck on the wall, which is what often happens when books are taken apart and the individual folios are displayed. But when you do this, when you take a piece of paper and you put it in a case like this, thinking that somebody's going to have a chair there, or you could lean on that bar and lean over it, it's one of the most difficult things you're going to end up with is how to light it. Because the light then bounces right back into your eye off that angled reflective surface. So struggling with that led to many bitter battles between various departments, design, architecture, curatorial, etc., but all to the good of the final project, because I think we will have in the end been able to figure out a way to light the paintings and to show the paintings so that you can really appreciate the incredible detail. And I'm going to show you a folio from the Khamsa of Amir Khusro Dehlavi that Professor Soucek showed you, mentioned earlier, that extraordinary manuscript of 16th century Mughal India. This is a page showing Behram Gur, the great, the hero of this section of the story, in a fairy princess's night garden, where he's being entertained every night by the princess and her attendants. Now this painting, there's the fairy that you see up here in the sky above. Here's a detailed picture of her. Now the painting itself is probably as big as this piece of paper. That fairy is probably about 3 inches across. I've magnified it maybe several thousand times. And do look at the incredible detail of that. It holds up to that kind of magnification, and it just gets better. If you look at her, look at the moon for a start. Do you see those little rays of light coming out of the moon? That is the sense of light. If you look at her body, you see that it's ever so slightly fuzzy around the edges. That's because her entire body is covered with tiny feathers, each of which has been individually painted. And all those wonderful colors in her feathery wings. This kind of detail is simply not visible unless you make sure that the viewing conditions are absolutely superb. Here's another detail from the same painting. In the background, you see there's something known as a Persian water wheel. You see these still in use in Iran and parts of India today. And it's a beautifully, perfectly logically executed depiction of a Persian water wheel, which again, you would not be able to see at all if the viewing conditions were not ideal. If you look, you can see the water goes in those pots, goes down the channel. Sorry, I'm not quite able to see myself. Yep, down that way, into this little pool, down that water slide, into that little pool, and then irrigating that night garden all around. The bolster upon which the couple lean is executed in 2 shades of gold. And Islamic manuscripts are so extraordinary, they can do up to 5 shades of gold. So just to be able to show those 2 shades of gold, again, we believe that it's worth the effort to be able to provide this kind of opportunity to the viewer. And here are more details from the famous Shahnameh of Shah Tehmasp, one of the great treasures of the museum. 76 folios of this masterpiece are with the museum, and again, very detailed, incredible paintings. Very quickly, we are collaborating with other departments in order to show parts of the show arts of the Islamic world that are not just in the Islamic department. For example, the Arms and Armor department at the museum has works of art that are made for Islamic rulers and warriors. And here you have a yatagan, or one of the great swords made for Suleiman the Magnificent, and a Turkmen helmet of the 15th century. We're also collaborating with the Asian department, who hold the non-Islamic Indian material of the same period. In other words, works of art from the Rajput courts of Rajasthan and the Pahari Hills. And so therefore works of art like this will be shown near works of art like that, and it will all add up to one combined joint expression of the arts of later India from 1500 to 1900. And the last section is a very important one, because it's all very well to have these wonderful treasures, but to get our audiences to engage and to appreciate and to respond to these takes a lot of thinking. So for example, we hope to have special areas where visitors can experience groups of material, such as these wonderful Persian drawings that we have. Another area dedicated to archaeological material from Nishapur, the excavations that took place in the 1930s in this very important site of Nishapur. And here we will have video monitors and a lot of interesting information on the excavation itself. And then encouraging connoisseurship and encouraging people to actually use their eyes is sometimes done better when you don't provide the information than when you actually tell them what they're looking at. So for example, here I have 2 paintings of the same subject. One of them is a 17th century original, if you like, work of a great Mughal master showing a dervish and his bear. And the other one is a 19th century copy, not a modern copy, a 19th century copy. And if I don't tell you which is which, but I show you those details and ask you to really look at those faces and imagine which one of those faces is post-Victorian, if you like, which one of those faces has a psychology almost that we can relate to today, and which one is of a different world, if you like, because that's what you must know. And then if I showed you, and the psychology is just, by the way, not only on the human faces, it's also in the bears' faces. And if I showed you under microscopic magnification the difference in quality between the 19th century and the 17th century one, you will immediately see that one of the chains is superbly painted. And the other one is an approximation. And you will see that one of these is a beautiful composition with a curving, you know, the arch of the foot is beautifully curved here, even though it's been corrected, and meets that. Whereas look at that. I mean, I'm already giving it away. This one, excuse me. This one this is the copy, and this is the original. I'll show you the faces again. This is the work of the great master Govardhan, who was one of the great psychologists of the Mughal period. When he painted a man whose life was an inner life, his eyes are inward looking. Even his animal looks inward looking. But this face is the face of somebody who knows Victorian England, who knows those wonderful portraits of beautiful ladies looking out at the viewers, and that's the difference. And being able to show these kinds of comparisons is a way of engaging the viewer. As is the educational side of the whole project, we will of course produce a great many documents, such as a great catalog that's being edited by Professor Suchek. We will have a very strong presence on the web, and this is really a key way for us to move beyond the four walls of our institution, of the galleries, and really spread knowledge of the collection and the ideas around the collection to audiences all over the world. So we plan to take the web very, very seriously, especially for the younger generation who are so web-oriented. And then in the galleries, we hope to bring the living arts, the living traditions of the Islamic world and of education in the galleries to the space itself. And so, for example, we will have all these wonderful performances and have people in the galleries studying the objects. As you can see, they are here. So we hope to welcome you next year, and do make it a point to come. Otherwise, we'll come back and tell you how it's going. Thank you very much.
I'd just like to start by saying that I'm full of admiration. I think that was a wonderful complement of two lectures. It strikes me that your work, Priscilla, is extremely timely now to provide the background, in providing the background to this work of reinstallation and remodeling. There was a real sense of modularity about different kinds of modularity, I would say, through your two lectures, because we got a real sense of sort of hermetically sealed off kinds of art through the various collectors that you took us through, Moore and Cochrane and Jackson, metalwork and leaves, illustrated leaves, and rugs, but no sort of integration. So there's a kind of modularity there. But the display of art is always about juxtaposition, necessarily. But you have to sort of reconceptualize the juxtaposition, right?
Well, actually, 19th century collectors were often media specific, and in that period, in the early decades of the museum, in 1880s, 1890s, in the early part of the 20th century, decorative arts was very often media, divided by media. So you had a ceramic gallery or a metalwork gallery or a glass gallery. And so that was really, the collectors in their collecting practice are actually reflecting the period and its sort of division of works of art. And they didn't discriminate between periods, but they discriminated between media. And so, but we've now moved in a different direction, as Navina was saying. We look for a more integrated idea of a period in its various manifestations. So it's really a different philosophical position, in a way, on what a work of art is. What does it represent? How do you interpret it? Do you try to put it back into its setting and its time, or do you look at it as an isolated object, which is sort of set apart from the maker and his setting? Mm-hmm. So I think that it's really two different moments.
That's true.
I do want to open it up to the audience, but and thank you for that. I was wondering if I could, maybe, I don't know, I hope you forgive me, and maybe someone will throw tomatoes at me for bringing this up, but it strikes me that when you open up in 2011, it'll be 10 years from 2001, September the 11th. Mm-hmm. And New York, well, the whole of the States, the whole world indeed, has sort of been traumatized in various ways. And it seems to me there's a lot to live down in America, I feel, has a lot to live down, feels it has a lot to live down. New York has a lot to live down for the hysteria that it went through in the aftermath of September the 11th. So it does strike me that 10 years on will be a good moment to sort of mark this new page. How much has the sort of that backdrop to been important or not, or completely irrelevant, maybe I'm just imagining, in the reconceptualization, in the sort of impetus that was behind this whole remodeling?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, when we do our work as curators, we try to inhabit a pure bubble of above any kind of political issue, and in that pure space, we do our best for the objects within the historical context of their original moment. But at the same time, we are sensitive to the charged moment in which we are doing our work, and sooner or later, we bring that to bear as well. But we don't let it be the major influence on our work, because first and foremost, we're art historians, and we're trying to, sort of do what we're trained to do in that sense. Having said that, I do feel that there are many aspects of this gallery plan that go some way towards, let's say, building a bridge of understanding, if you like, or points of connection between various cultures. One of the ideas of having different openings and connecting to European tradition in different ways is one way that the material naturally lends itself to being, laid out. The idea of a gallery of Western Islamic art, I think, makes the point about 8 centuries of Islam in Europe. Mm-hmm. So that's something that we, take great pride in having established, because again, I feel it's just the right moment when the world needs to see these spaces, needs to see a commitment to these ideas, and the feeling that history supports it and our moment supports it, and so that's sort of the way we've approached it.
Thank you. So please, there's a gentleman here. If you could, yeah, could you introduce yourself, sir?
Well, I guess that's a question for me. That's a very good question, and that's something we're still looking into. One of the, in my research on the building of the collection, I haven't really gotten into the archival aspect, but it will be the next stage of my work. And I have discovered, not in the case of Cochrane, I don't know how much I'm going to be able to do with him, because we have no papers from the family that I'm aware of. But the Havemeyer collection, for example, their private papers exist and are in the museum, actually. They were donated probably by a member of the family. And there's an entire box that probably relates to how they purchased works of art from a dealer named Dikran Kilikian, who's primarily known as a dealer in the arts of the Islamic Near East. Now, Kilikian dealt in other things too, because the period was had multiple interests. So I'm not certain that everything that Kilikian sold them was from the Near East, but there is a box of papers relating to the Havemeyer purchases from Kilikian. And Ballard's papers exist in St. Louis. I have not gone there, but there are boxes and boxes of transaction papers, records, financial records, of how Ballard bought his rugs, from whom he bought his rugs, how much he paid for his rugs, etc. So that is really a level of investigation which I haven't really been able to get into. I don't know, I mean, for our publication, I don't think it's probably a little detailed, but there may be things that emerge from it that will help us to understand that question. Now, I was particularly interested in Edward Chandler Moore, who collected in the 1860s and 1870s. And one thing that I haven't been able to do about him, because again, I just haven't had time, is that I think in his case, we may be able to have some sense of what motivated him, because he also donated his library to the museum. I haven't looked at it, but the books are still there. There's actually a whole book of inventory, a very large library. So, we think that perhaps they didn't know very much, but it was actually something that had been under consideration for at least decades. From the late 18th century, people were curious and began publishing examples of things. They didn't always know what it was, I mean, they called things Saracenic or Moorish, there are lots of categories that we wouldn't use. But there was a curiosity and there was an interest. And people had actually been studying Near Eastern languages in Europe for hundreds of years. And so there were people available who could tell you what an inscription said. There were people who could read for you an Arabic inscription or a Persian text. And maybe these collectors didn't know how to do it, but they probably knew people who could. So, we exaggerate a bit the relative difference between our knowledge and their knowledge in terms of thinking that it's new. But it actually, there were people who knew a lot. They wouldn't have explained it quite the way we do, probably. But so I hope in these particular cases that maybe I'll be able to dig a little more deeply into the process. And I don't know with Moore how much I'll find out about where he bought what. That may be hard, because in the 1860s, 1870s, I don't think there are papers from his family that have, I've not yet found any. His, one thing which I will be able to do more with, though, is his personal artistic creations, because his drawings are in the archives of the Tiffany Company. So I don't know how much it will tell me, but I can, if I take the time and Tiffany allows me, I can probably examine his notebooks and see the sketches he made and how he was sort of creating these objects. And maybe taking his library, his sketches, and everything all together, I will be able to have a little more sense of what he was doing. But in this period, they weren't really interested in history that very much. They really thought that the object was a thing by itself, in and of itself. And if you ever are in New York State and you have time to go up the Hudson Valley to Olana, the home of Frederick Church, the great landscape painter, it's an absolutely perfect example of how in the late 19th century they made something new out of pieces of various things. And Olana is really a living example of how a decor was created with a piece from India, a piece from Turkey, a piece from Spain, and all put together in a new way. So they're different perspectives.
Thank you. My name is Mohammed Kano. I have a question about maybe following on the earlier question about provenance. About the provenance of the pieces you have. Right. We've seen, decimation of the Getty collection of late. We don't want this collection to face a similar challenge. I think that it may require going the extra length to clarify the fascinating histories of the people who collected these works, and to include that as part of the process, because it adds so much more value to the pieces, and they bring them so much more life, bring them much to life for us. In the question or the comment I have, or the conclusion, how many pieces will actually be exhibited at the collection? No, it's a bit for both of you. Thank you.
It's really of a collection of 12,000. Not all the pieces are exhibitable in the sense a lot of them are study pieces, a lot of them are ceramic shards, a lot of them are smaller fragments of things. So at any one time we will show 1,000 objects in the gallery, with a huge many more rotating through. So in other words, objects that are light sensitive, textiles and paintings, cannot be shown for more than 3 months at a time. So if you change them every 3 months or 4 months, let's say twice a year, 3 times a year, the gallery will change its nature. So we hope to rotate, all the exhibitable items through the course of a year or over 2 or 3 years through the space.
If you could just take the mic, simply, it's just because people at the back can't hear otherwise. Thanks.
I'm Susan Whistler, and a former New Yorker who loves the museum and encourage everyone to go there when you're in New York. But my question, I have 2 questions. I know you said you went to Doha and were in that museum. Could you compare a little bit? I know you were just probably there briefly, but what you're doing to that museum, to your museum versus that museum. How do you think those two compare in terms of size and display and like that? Just in terms of these are 2 big major collections in the world of Islamic art collections and showings. My second question is, with the new museums that will be established here in Abu Dhabi, and you're doing this connection here with Abu Dhabi NYU, do you think there could be a traveling show from the Met's collection that would ever come to one of these, maybe the Louvre Museum, so that we could actually see these things here? And in some degree, they would be returned to their area. Not specifically, but they would be in the Middle East as opposed to being in New York City. So the thought about that, those 2 thoughts.
Those are both excellent questions. Let me start with your first question, if you don't mind, and then Dr. Haidar will address the second one. As for the collection in Doha at the Museum of Islamic Art, it's a fabulous collection, as you were implying, I think. It is extraordinarily high quality. It's a collection that was built in the Middle East. There's a Kuwaiti collection that is its core, collection by a Kuwaiti gentleman that was acquired by the patron of the museum. So it was a similar process, buying at auction, building up pieces, it is amazingly high quality, I would say. It equals any museum in Europe, I would say, in terms of quality of objects. I don't know, I don't have statistics about how many things there are, but it's a large collection. It took us several hours to go through it. Of course, we were going a little slowly, but it is a very substantial collection. But I can't give you an actual number. I'm sure they have numbers, I just don't know them. So I think it's comparable. It's really a comparable kind of experience to go to Doha, to go to the Louvre, to go to the British Museum. I think it's on that level. And I think, I don't swear that it's exactly the same size, but it's of a scope that is absolutely on the par. And so I think that's a remarkable accomplishment, and because it's not easy to buy now. It's much harder to find objects. It's more expensive than it was 100 years ago. And so I think it's really extraordinary that it has been accomplished in that way. But it's absolutely first class.
And to answer your second question, the main thing about traveling shows is the venues have to be approved in the sense that for the fragility, for the condition of the objects, they have to be in a space that is secure, that is environmentally appropriate, and so on. But barring that, once that is achieved, and I'm told that there are maybe 2 places now in Abu Dhabi that have those international standards of display sort of requirements. Definitely, I don't see why. I think the Met has always been extremely open about lending. All through these years that the galleries were closed, many objects traveled all over the world, including a big group to Saudi Arabia, and so on. So I'm sure sooner or later it will happen, if it, hopefully sooner, because it would be wonderful for people to get to know these collections and see them, one-to-one in the flesh, so to speak, here and elsewhere. So.
And actually, I don't think I'm giving anything away to say that I think the NYU Abu Dhabi does have a plan to establish a gallery for traveling exhibitions, and there is anticipated that the shows will come from Europe and the United States. That part of the process is not yet unfolded. They're still building up the campus, but it's I don't know exactly what the prospective date of the operation of this gallery is projected, but this is very much in the plans as a goal. So it may take a while to get there, but it's an ambition that NYU has.
Good evening, Marianne Kennedy. Navina, thank you so much for the presentation of the future gallery at the Metropolitan. This was very engaging, and I wish you'd be present every day when the gallery open and be our guide all the time, because you have such a wonderful way of presenting and talking about the object. I feel as if I've never seen an object properly in a museum before. It's a really eye-opening presentation, and well done for all the work you've done to come up. I mean, all the preparation, all the thinking you've put into this project is really awesome in the first sense of the term. Navina, I had one question. You mentioned this project of educating the public to what is a masterpiece. And you showed this wonderful drawing of a dragon, and saying that, if I understood well, that people didn't know what constituted a masterpiece of Islamic art, as opposed to we know what are masterpiece of Western art. But what struck me is that maybe we don't really know what a masterpiece is unless we've been told and educated, but we take them very much for granted. A lot of people go and see the Mona Lisa because we are told that it is a masterpiece. But if it hadn't been pointed out as a masterpiece, would we queue for hours in the Louvre trying to elbow our way in front of the display case to say, yeah, I saw the Mona Lisa because we had to see it. How anybody can know what is a masterpiece? Western art, Islamic art, any kind of art. And are you going to have some workshop about that, or about art history in general, or art appreciation?
Actually,
it would be great if you did.
Word masterpiece means.
Yeah, I will thank you so much for all your kind words. It's been firstly a great education for me and my colleagues to have been part of this project. It's a dream of any curator to have the chance to think about the basics from what you're doing, from the nature of the collection, to what you're trying to say about it and how you're trying to put it to express its virtues to others. So in the process of engaging with all those questions, we are the greatest beneficiaries because we learn so much and we ask so many questions of ourselves and of our field, of our colleagues, of the material. It's a great education. It's something that I personally will always be grateful for, to have had the opportunity to have had. But the question that you've raised about masterpieces is really an important one. Professor Soucek is going to just answer the question maybe about what the concept of a masterpiece, and then I'll say a few words about how we've approached it in the gallery. So,
if you go back to really what literally the word means, the two parts of it, the concept of the masterpiece is something which an object or work in which an artist demonstrates the achievement of a high level of skill. And it used to be in the period when people were trained as apprentices under masters, that their sort of graduation, if you will, was to create an object or some work which was judged of the standard accomplishment that would be a master, and therefore to receive the permission to be a master and to pass on the skill to the next generation. So that's where the idea of the masterpiece really comes out of a system of training where artists train each other, and as people reach a level of maturity, they demonstrate that maturity through the creation of some particular thing. So that's sort of the core of the meaning. But of course, it has, in common speech, sort of evolved into a broader and less specific kind of idea of something which is of a very high standard, sort of beyond the ordinary. So and so that's sort of our modern use of it. But you kind of you can have both kinds of masterpiece, I think.
That's true. And when we've been looking at this material, it just struck me and all of our colleagues that, you know, we, in the context of the Metropolitan Museum, you have 17 curatorial departments and so many different galleries. And if you asked each other as colleagues, can you name me a masterpiece in the European gallery? It's easier for people, just our own body of colleagues, it's easier for them to name masterpieces or well-known pieces in certain galleries as opposed to others. And you have to ask yourself, why is that the case? Is it that the material isn't well known in the same way? Obviously, that's one answer. Is the concept of masterpiece different? And so on and so forth. And for example, I would confess if somebody asked me to name a musical instrument masterpiece, you know, I would be hard pressed to think about exactly which one I would say is the one to name, or so, etc. So in the case of the Islamic collections, we are trying to think about patronage levels, about the works of art themselves. For example, the arts of the book are traditionally considered to be, you know, the sort of great art. And then the art of ceramic production is huge amounts of production. So how do you say that the one piece out of 200 others like it is the masterpiece? You're doing something different there. You're comparing it to others of its type and saying for various aesthetic and other technical perhaps reasons, this piece is superior to the others. But was it created as a one individual masterpiece to start with? Was that the concept? Not necessarily. In the case of the arts of the book, you do have the idea of a great master painter or a great master calligrapher whose one contribution or greatest moment or expression is in this area. And so you have to work with those intrinsic values of the pieces in the context in which they were created, and to our world, which is that I do feel that there is a certain thrill that we all have, a way of connecting with material, to be in the presence of, to actually see the real thing. But then you have to know what it is that you were sort of seeking, if you like. And so creating those points of reference to be able to hang moments, history, experiences, you know, on are so important. So that's one of the things we're trying to do in the introduction gallery, so that people know what are the high points at different levels. There'll be a great ceramic, there'll be a great piece of metalwork, there'll be superb paintings there'll be folios from manuscripts, religious manuscripts, etc. So that's the idea.
Perhaps we have time for one more question. Nelly? Oh, yeah, there's a mic there.
Hi. I'm Nelly Lama. I teach art history. I can't find words that are superlative enough to tell you how great you are, how your website is great, how much you've been of service to us. Throughout my teaching, I've been referring your Metropolitan Museum to all my students because of the exhaustive study you've done, the great pictures you've put into your web. The museum itself is beyond words, so I hope you forgive me for the next thing I'm going to say. I don't understand you're putting the Orientalist paintings along with Islamic art. I think it's a, sorry?
It's not along, it's just, it's the next gallery.
It's in the same, it's outside.
It's outside, yeah, it's outside. It's not in the same gallery.
I would understand. Because it's a bit shocking to me. And the painting that you put up, the Jérôme, is one specific painting that in my teaching has made, hell broke loose when Muslims looked at it and found like so many points that are totally non-Islamic, having people pray in a mosque naked with the weapons, with everything. Like, okay, I understand it's not, it's part of the painting and everything, but I would really I would like that it is not part of the actual Islamic art thing.
When you come to New York next, we'll show you, because the European department's gallery happens to have a door through which you can pass into the Islamic collection. And that is the extent of the relationship. It's not they're not integrated, they will never be integrated, they will be juxtaposed. And the question of the interpretation of the paintings, that's obviously a complicated issue, how to approach Orientalist painting. But for an American audience, it helps them, I think, to see that in the 19th century, the things were not unknown. I mean, there was obviously the question of interpretation, but also that it's not totally foreign, that people had seen things or had been there. Now, Gérôme has a complicated history himself, and what is very interesting about Gérôme as a painter is that he had a Turkish collaborator in the form of Osman Hamdi, who was the director of the Archaeological Museum in Istanbul. He founded under the Ottomans. It was called Mektebi Sani Humayun. So it was the Imperial Ottoman Museum. Osman Hamdi was a French-trained painter who actually studied with Gérôme. So he made photographs for Gérôme, and a lot of Gérôme's work is actually based on photographs rather than on the direct experience. In the case of the painting that you're talking about, there are photographs of interior. So he used architectural interior. Then they use models. They use living models, and they combine the two. It was what we call academic painting. They put together elements from different sources and created a new whole. Now, Gérôme was not an art historian. Gérôme was not a person documenting Islam. He was expressing a point of view. And you can agree with it, you can disagree with it. It is a period point of view. It is an artistic point of view that he happened to, but he did go the distance of getting authentic photographs, and architecture is much the best aspect of Orientalist painting in terms of accuracy. They really do render the space as it was seen by them. They don't invent architecture usually. They really use photographs. If you want to look at a place where people went over the top, try the Alhambra. Interpretations of the Alhambra in the 19th century were extraordinarily fantastic. I mean, the things that they imagined had happened in the Alhambra, blood flowing this way and that way, and people, princesses being ravished and one thing and another, which had absolutely nothing to do with Nasrid history and really very little to do with the building. People impose their imagination on a setting. So I think it's a very different exercise from what we do, which is really a kind of academic study. And we were just commenting on the fact that for the first time ever, you'll be able to walk from one gallery to another. Before, there was a wall, and there was no way to know that there was an Islamic gallery on the other side. It's a fact.
And there'll be a lot more in that 19th century gallery than Gérôme. They have things that they will be rotating. So for example, there'll be Daniel's watercolors of vistas from studies of architecture. There'll be natural studies from their albums that they have. So that's just one example of the kind of material they'll show. So
long as you sort of make a point of the contrived nature of the Orientalists. Thank you.
Not equation. No equations.
No equation.
I'm sure there are other questions, but let me just say one thing. I'm always envious of people who study Islamic art because they have such beautiful images to show people, which I don't have in my field. Nevertheless, you have to be able to accompany those images with detail and deftness and eloquence, and that's exactly what you've both done. So thank you both very much.
Thank you.